Welcome to the show today. Today, I got Mark Seall on the show, and I'm very excited to talk to you and dive a little bit into your story. So, Mark is the head of digital communication at Siemens, and he's making quite a bit of waves in this whole area. We talked last time a little bit about that. I'm very excited to dive into the story, a little bit about, the lessons you learned along the way, and a little bit about the future as well, where things are heading and what kind of exciting things you're currently working on. So, Mark, maybe you can give a quick intro and share like one or two moments or parts of your journey that really shaped you as a human being, as a person, as a leader.
Oh, okay. But I guess I arrived at this point through a sort of a slightly random route. Definitely not the one I would have originally expected. My very brief kind of career history is I started as a classic IT developer. I went that back in those days, back in the sort of the 90s. You took the IT development to project management type route. I guess early 2000s, I wanted to do something completely different. I quit my job to do a full-time MBA, which was just a fantastic experience, just to get away from all of that stuff. For me, that was sort of the most important thing about the MBA was not what you learned, to be honest. I guess everyone says that, but for me, it was to have 18 months where you were free from constraints. So all the thinking you did and everything you could write down, you didn't really have to think about the real world, totally free from constraints. And that was really, really hard to go sort of, to management consulting after that, where you were basically just full of constraints. Which I think is what prompted me after a short time to co-found an online startup. I felt that absolute sense of freedom once again. That, of course, to be honest, a dot-com startup is a young man's job, because you need to be prepared to sleep on the floor, to live with nothing, to work insanely, which I'm totally fine in doing. But when you're in your mid-30s, that's you begin to accumulate additional responsibilities in your life. But it was good. I did that for about 3.5 years before realizing I needed to think about life again a little bit. And we had a good let's call it a convenient exit opportunity. And I guess that's really when my sort of current stage begins. Because I think at that point I was looking for something to do. One thing I was sure of after the startup experience was never work for a large corporation at all, which of course is now I'm working for one of those corporate corporations. I was pretty sure I didn't want to do that, and I think that's probably one of the most important milestones for me. So at that point, I was asked to speak at a conference being run by ABB, because I was a web guy, and their communications conference, they wanted to talk about this transition to social media and understand how the traditional companies are seen, etc., etc. That was the point that I got into contact with my current boss. And after we did this conference, I did my little talk. We had some discussions, and I was convinced to join ABB at that point. And as I described it back in, when was that, 2010, 2011, as I described it back then, working for ABB was like working for the world's biggest startup, particularly in that area, with the benefit that you knew you were going to get paid every month. So it was like that because basically I was free to rethink what we were doing, to throw away the old rule book, to innovate, to be different. Those were really, really great times. And I think I lucked into one of the sort of most interesting jobs in the corporate world, because communications is something where digitization is changing things absolutely massively. So we had the chance to rethink at ABB. When I got the chance to move to Siemens, the task is slightly different because the world has moved on by 5, 6, 7 years. But that was an amazing opportunity to again be in that position where you can rethink, where you can innovate, where you have, you still have to live with corporate constraints and all of these things. But it's kind of cool because I think I can put into that whole kind of, that whole previous experience to work in one place. That's the current, a version of the current story.
I love, also the controversial story, I guess, but the startup and the corporate world, because when you talk to both sides, they don't really necessarily look into joining the other side, so to say. And
Yeah.
those are very interesting to see, like sort of like the way you look at everything today may be completely different tomorrow, even though you would never believe yourself. You would go back 10 years and talk to yourself, and you as 10 years ago, you would probably go like, well, no, and then you just wouldn't see it probably. And that's always really fascinating to me as well. The other thing is the people that always there's always certain kinds of people that shape us along the way. There's experiences, but there's also people. Is there somebody in your life, along the way, along your career, that really had an impact on your journey?
I guess there are a lot of people. That's the easy answer. I think a couple in particular. I think when I joined when we started out the startup thing, the other guys, my co-founders, were 10 years younger than me. So I was in my early 30s, they were in their early 20s. And it was very interesting because it's exactly what you were just talking about. I'd come very much from the corporate world. And I think I had this an arrogance about things, because you think, okay, I know how to do things in large companies, and that's going to be the best way. Here we just have a tiny little office, and you have absolutely no clue. You have all this corporate experience. I know how to structure things. And I very, very quickly realized that everything I learned in the corporate world was completely irrelevant, because actually 90% of all of that corporate structure, etc., is actually waste. It's actually just sort of like, it's the superfluous of baggage that you need to run a large organization. It's nothing about getting the job done. And I think these guys, David Anderson and Clayton Cornell, I think they very, very smart people, which had none of this kind of baggage of experience that I had. So they would think about a problem or a solution purely in terms of, let's get it done. They absolutely didn't care about the stuff around it. I mean, and it's amazing, because I remember when I went back to the corporate world afterwards, one of the first things my first week, I found myself sitting in a steering committee, and I thought, this is just the most pointless exercise. The entire reason of the steering committee is so that everyone here feels somewhat comfortable and somewhat covered. We would never have done that in the startup world, because that was absolutely not what was important. So anyway, I think those two guys kind of like, that massively shaped me. And I think they helped convert me very, very quickly back to a more pragmatic way of doing things. And I think I learned an awful lot from them, and really, appreciated what smart people can achieve. Then I guess I had to choose a couple of influential people. I'm not saying this just to suck up, but I'd have to mention my boss, Clarissa Haller, who I worked for, who convinced me to join ABB, and who I then followed to Siemens, that I've now worked for 7-8 years. I think that needs special mention, because I think there are very few people back in those days I would have even considered working for, having had that, having not worked for anybody for some time. And I think it's a very rare kind of quality in the corporate world to really have vision, and to really not care too much about the optics and consequences of every single decision or the direction of things, but really to want to challenge and to want to rethink, and to give the space to do that, and basically to give the space and the trust to just go ahead and change things. And that's been very, very important to me. And that's also shown that, I think in a world where too many decisions are made too much by consensus, to have the benefit of a real genuine leader that makes genuine decisions and acts of courage. I think that's been pretty important. So I think, and I guess we're influenced by people every single day, right? So it's hard to list everybody, but yeah.
Now, this is a really good pointers, and it kind of like drives me into the next piece, which is like, okay, so you had your startup there, you had lots of freedom, whatever that means, right? And then suddenly you go back into the corporate world. Of course, one reason you mentioned, because you found somebody who really has that kind of vision and drives things forward. To work together with somebody like that, of course, is a massive opportunity. But then still, for me, it's like, okay, that's great. Why go into organizations like these, work with these organizations that are fairly traditional, and there's of course lots of work to do. But what is your own driver for transforming organizations like that?
It's a very good question. Because yeah, I mean, you mentioned the word traditional, and I mean, let's be honest, right? Traditional, I guess, is code for sort of like formal and restrictive, and it's exactly those constraints I was talking about. I guess there's a couple of reasons. Well, let's be honest, part of it by accident, but I think they pose their own unique challenges and their own unique benefits. I mean, one of the benefits, of course, is that if you have an organization of that kind of scale, you can make the kind of investments and you can make the kind of leverage that you can't do somewhere else. So, you can't invest a huge amount in developing an artificial intelligence solution if you're in a small, medium enterprise. It just doesn't make sense. So I think you do have the ability to really innovate because you can leverage that. I think two other reasons. One is that the nature of the challenge is very different, because implementing technologies or building technology, well, that's hard enough. But we have a slightly different problem, because I think if we build a really cool bit of technology, that's half of the problem. The real challenge is how you scale it, and how do you get several thousand people to use it, or how do you basically introduce something which is going to disrupt a massive process, which involves lots and lots of people. And I think that's where you kind of actually really need to kind of get a grip on leadership, because yeah, in a small organization where where your span of control is basically, it's very hierarchically defined, you can do these kind of things. But in such large organizations where you have this multi-dimensional matrix, where you're looking at the organizational function, the country, the division, all of these things come together. People are influenced by many things. They rarely report to one single person. You have to really be able to influence. You have to really kind of apply kind of market-based economics to the solutions that you build. And I think that you do actually operate in a sort of like mini cosmos almost of all of these things. So I think that's part of the appeal. That's part of what makes you deal with some of the other less positive things. And just the final one as well, I think it's one of the things. I think that the cultural and sort of multi-global nature of it makes it also interesting. Having to do this, having to think about these solutions universally at scale. And to meet all the different people from those different backgrounds, to have that sort of global reach, just kind of fun.
Yeah, these are some really interesting pointers there, especially about the scale and the impact of things, and also kind of like, the reach, of course, you have with something like that. It's very interesting. It's always a question that I'm very curious about, talking to these intrapreneurs, so to say, like what makes them tick. And that's kind of like my next question also, like, what is it that makes you tick? Like, has there been a red thread throughout your life where you say, well, this is always the thing that when I got involved in that just provided energy for me versus, it drained my energy. It was always the kind of thing that really, really drives me. That's the thing that I get to do every day, or that's the thing that I get up for every single day.
Yeah, I guess it probably comes down to the fact that I get to play with new stuff and build new stuff. I mean, I guess ever since I was a kid, the latest gadget or whatever, the latest computer, being a bit of that was always really, really exciting. I guess what I get to do today is build new stuff. Ultimately, I like building things. I get to build new stuff, and I get to share that experience with lots of other people, because part of my job is to see how we can use that to change what people are doing. So yeah, I get to build new toys and share them with people. That's fundamentally pretty exciting.
It does sound very exciting. And let's maybe stay on this topic and go a little bit into maybe a past story. Maybe it's around building or something that you have been involved in. I'd love to discuss a little bit of lessons learned. Has there been some sort of a interesting failure story or success story that you would like to share from the past, where from the lessons you really learned something fundamental?
Where would we start? Where would we start? I don't know if this is a very clever thing to say, but I mean, I would say that, to be quite honest with you, probably about half of it has been failure. Yeah, probably about half of it. And I mean, that's maybe a stupid thing to say, but I put that down to the fact that I think if you want to do new stuff, if you want to innovate, you've got to accept that a lot of this stuff won't work. It's like the whole startup thing. I like to say that I put more experience in the bank than money. Sadly true. But I think what you need to take away from those failures, though, is first of all how you make that look, because you can sell a failure as a success. It depends how flexible you want to be with changing the ambition when it comes to the end. But definitely, what you learn and what you can apply is probably the most important. If we're looking for a specific example which doesn't burn anybody else, that one I need to think a little bit about. I know, because I think most of the things that we do probably are sort of like, I talk about innovation, but a lot of innovation is usually iterations of the past. I think you need to give me just a moment to think here, because when I talk about burning people, it's
Sure.
There's a lot of sensitivities, particularly in the corporate world, about failure and what you sort of who's implicated in that.
It could be from your startup as well. It doesn't have to be from the corporate.
Yeah. No, well, okay, no. So, okay, let me answer that one then. So let's take a good example of failures, or let's not call them failures, but sort of like incremental successes, maybe we can call them. I think one of the sort of holy grails we've been looking at from a corporate communication perspective is how do you build that perfect platform which allows you to really engage your audience. So there's many things you have to do there. The starting point is how do you build something which can extract content from your organization, the genuine, interesting content, not the sanitized corporate content. Then how do you build an experience around that your users can actually engage with, and then how do you promote it? And I think that's something we've been working on now for sort of like 5, 6, 7 years. We've been through multiple iterations of trying to do this. So starting at ABB, where we built this a platform called Conversations, which I think was it depends how you measure success. In many ways, very, very successful. But I think in most dimensions, successful. Did it really do that core thing we were looking for of like creating this amazing experience? Did we create something which was genuinely unique and changed the world? No, we didn't. We improved it, etc. And then now we're sort of like looking at that problem again from a different set of angles, and we can take all of the things that we learned into it. One of those key things is when designing something like this, you can get very excited about the technology aspect, about the design aspect, all of these. The human aspect is really the difficult one to fix, because most design approaches would lead you to introduce kind of the human element from a user point of view, but some of these things I'm talking about mean that we have to look at these much deeper human motivations that we have, about why is there a problem? Why do corporates have difficulty creating this kind of solutions? Why do people not necessarily trust corporations in doing this? So there's all these kind of lessons, and it's interesting because when we started the new project, and then we started to realize actually that by the measures of the new project, what a dismal attempt the previous. I think your new successes make your others sort of look worse and worse. And of course, we still haven't solved that yet, but we have a different approach now to doing it, and we've realized that this human aspect is much, much more important. The first version of that, to be honest, which is there now, doesn't really tick the boxes either. We haven't got it there, but I think we're getting closer to understanding the issues. So, I think that's maybe a bit of a weak answer, because you asked me sort of, to talk about experiences of great failures and whatever. Apart from obvious complete screw-ups, which happen quite regularly, I think that's the most instructive example I can give.
I mean, that's a big one. Yeah. Because what you basically said is, I'm just trying to repeat that, is, at one point you decide, okay, you want to build a platform, and you focus on the platform and you build everything around it. And I guess the learning out of it was like, well, it's not necessarily about the platform or just the platform. There's so much more about the human aspect of things that were maybe not considered enough, or are so difficult to figure out, so to say. that it wasn't a big success that you're looking for. And that's kind of like, that's also the lesson in it that you kind of like pulled out, which is like, okay, maybe it's more to do with behaviors, more to do with everything about human. And the platform then is simply, okay, it maybe doesn't matter so much about the features at the end of the day and everything around it. Of course, it always does matter, but if it's 20% a deviation or something like that, it doesn't matter that much. What matters more is understanding the human being as a human being.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've taken that really to be the core of our strategy right now. And when we looked at exactly what we're trying to do here, we figured out that actually the core of what we do is how we connect content with human beings. That's what a communications function does. And it's been useful to express it in that term, because what we realize is actually we have a pretty good idea about content. We have a pretty good idea about the software and the platforms bit, which is the connecting tissue. What we don't really understand is what we're connecting with, because a human being is a pretty complex thing. And it's an interesting challenge, because there's no real frameworks out there to figure that out. Well, there are. I mean, there's a lot written about sort of psychology and leadership and all this kind of stuff, but not necessarily in our context. And we haven't, as a function, really been used to doing that. So that's, I guess, the human being is the next big frontier for us.
It's a really interesting topic, and it kind of like drives me into the next one, which is leadership. Leadership has to do a lot with human beings. And so you're in charge of a pretty large organization, internal and then external, even bigger. So how do you lead in such an organization? How do you do everything day to day? How do you balance all of this and still stay sane at the same time? So how do you go all about all these things? So question really is about the sanity.
I think the one thing that I learned, I'm not sure how I learned it, but I was reflecting on this because there was a period where I figured out that you can't focus on everything. You have to just let a lot of things go. I think there was a long period in my life where I would try to make sure everything was okay, and I wouldn't leave before that was done. And I was pretty OCD about a lot of things, to be honest. I can't remember when it was, but I think there was just some situation in this kind of corporate world I got into where I just had to leave a lot of stuff. And I think for me, that's the most important lesson, that we tend to think everything is important. Rarely it is. So I think I learned to focus. And I think what I've realized actually is as I've gotten older, I've gotten busier, and I've kind of, like most people, you gain responsibility as you grow older. I think probably I work fewer hours now than I did 10 years ago. I mean, I may be more constantly engaged, and it's not like I'm slacking off, but I think I probably work fewer hours because I think I just got better at naturally prioritizing. And I think you just learn to prioritize, you learn to delegate, but importantly, you kind of mentally learn just to put it in the back of your mind, just to worry less. So I think that's my biggest trick to being sane. I think when you talk about generally how do you lead, because I think that's, as I mentioned earlier, I think I referenced the fact that in a complex global organization, leadership is really critical, because you have to influence those people. And I guess the phrase that always comes back to me is I mean, it's probably an old saying in the leadership world, but someone described leadership basically as the art of imposing your will through the influence of others. And I think, and I like that a lot, because there's always this tendency to control. And the bigger and the more traditional the organization, the more control you have. I mean, we love the word governance and these kind of things, and we tend to obsess with that. But the reality is, you just if you try and control all that stuff, you won't. You just have to influence. And so I think for me, the focus is very much on how do you influence, how can you inspire, how can you how can you come up with a good story? Because I think if you have a good story, then people will generally follow. So I'd sort of describe a lot of what I typically do actually as storytelling, which is a scary thought, because I wouldn't have ever put that down really as one of my natural strengths. But I think that's how you have to do it in this kind of organization, because you have to admit you cannot control that. And it's interesting. Sorry, I'm answering this question a long way, and it's interesting because one of the things we're learning right now, we're some of my colleagues are kind of quickly going towards is when we talk about how we work, or how our function works, and how we as Siemens get our message out there to the world. We're heavily moving away as quickly as we can from kind of traditional paid advertising, these kind of things, to this what we call an influencer model, because we've realized that the power we have through getting social media influencers to spread our message, and from investing in working with those guys, investing in spreading our message that way, is exponentially better than anything we've done before. Now, of course, a lot of people are saying, well, we all knew that. And of course, we've all known that. But I think really how you leverage that aspect and how you really make that work is something that we're getting some great success in. And I think it comes back to me that in a complex world, influence is basically the only way to do it.
Very interesting way of looking at it as well. I mean, on the one point on the sanity, but also in terms of how to lead, in terms of, well, sort of like two things on the influence, on the storytelling. That's kind of like what I heard. And of course, that has a lot to do with each other. And basically what you said is, well, we can't really control it, so stop trying, And that's a really interesting one, because, I mean, still today, so many, we all talk about leadership. We all talk about empowering. But at the end of the day, if you look at the reality, I mean, it's pretty much, the majority is still the same. It's still in control. It's still extremely hierarchical. It's still a chain of command. It's very often still the same. Much hasn't changed. So this is a very, very interesting way of putting it, because it's not like most people would say it, I guess, because this thing of storytelling usually just, maybe it's because, you come from marketing communications area as well. But this way of looking at it also from a storytelling perspective is much more tangible. Like when I hear it from the outside, I mean, it's much more tangible than saying, empowering and inspiring. Okay, I get that, great, nice buzzwords, right? We're all trying to do that. But when you put it into a more tangible perspective, saying, okay, instead of trying to give, commands and all these kinds of things, creating stories around that and a storyline and making people really understand because a story is also making people understand the reasons behind it and the whys. So it's all these kinds of important things are built into a story. Very fascinating. Really appreciate that. Last question is a bit more of a up in the clouds one. If you had a magic wand, so you were a magician, and you could basically wish for anything you wanted, what would you wish for that could multiply the impact you have on the organization, on your industry, on the world, at least 10 times?
Ooh, wow. Okay. What is the? I guess if we knew that, then we probably would just spend our time figuring out how to do it, rather than trying to do it the long way. So, to be honest, it's a difficult one, but I'm going to try and that's the easy way out. I'm going to have a go at this. So I think one of the tragedies I see. So when coming from a sort of having been in a very small organization, where let's look at a startup where you have the luxury of only having the best people you can possibly get, because you just can't afford to carry any weight at all. You have no legacy. You have no and you're just a couple of like perfectly suited people, and you get on with something. That's a massively powerful thing. The problem is that, and I think, and that's the beauty of a well-formed startup, that all of the human potential in that startup is being applied all of the time. You have that perfect situation, which is why startups can produce amazing, game-changing things. The problem with the classic organization is that they evolved over so much time. And as I mentioned earlier, there's so much baggage that comes with them. And honestly, I think very, very few organizations are capable of extracting the maximum amount of human potential. I think, to be honest, in most cases, the organization gets in the way of the human potential. People are often very much suppressed in terms of what they do. And I don't know. I mean, not an expert on this topic, to be honest, but I'd make a guess that in the average organization, and I think there are some statistics out there, sort of like 10 to 20% of people are engaged. The people that are engaged are maybe putting 20% of their horsepower on the road, because much of it is spent doing steering committees and other blah blah blah. So If you want that magic bullet, I'd say if we could find a way as an organization to unlock the actual potential of everyone that we have, so that they are living their passion, they're doing what they're good at, they're not inhibited by anything, they have no stupid guidelines, rules, idiotic stuff, then I think we would be amazing. I think that's probably the closest thing to the silver bullet. So yeah, we're working on part of that, but it's difficult to do.
I love both parts that you shared there. The first part you basically said, if we knew that, I think we would focus on that. And I think that's a crucial message as well, because, sometimes we don't even think much about that, right? Because very often we think about incremental change and incremental, let's 10% more and things like that. And suddenly if you start thinking 10 times and 100 times, you ask completely different questions. So I think that there is a really important point. And the second one, really, it goes in the same direction. Human potential, because longer hours, more productivity, and the traditional everything, that's 10%, But human potential, that's the 10 time or 100 time or 1,000 time multiplier. So this is a very, very interesting thing that you shared there. It goes in a really, really, of course, deep conversation. Goes back to the human part of things, of course, they shared before in terms of the lessons learned. So really, really, really good point. Last, just wanted to thank you so much for being on the show, for sharing these nuggets of wisdom and insights. We're going to link below the video to your LinkedIn profile and also the company page so people can explore more, also connect, for a conversation, for a connection, to follow you on what's up, what's going on. And once again, thank you so much for being on the show, Mark.
Likewise. Thank you very much. That was great. Thanks a lot.